Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 5 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Anaheim Ducks again, and this time lost by a score of 3-2 in the shootout. But before we get into talking about the roster for tonight's game, there is one thing that I do want to mention that has been an issue for the Sharks that I have noticed over much of this preseason, and in particular here tonight, which is a general lack of team cohesion. It feels as though we're watching 5 individuals on the ice just kind of doing their own thing, instead of watching 5 teammates who actually know how to work off of each other. And of course, it could be justified by the fact that the Sharks have brought in a few new faces this season, as well as a new head coach, but at the same time, that new head coach was with the team last year as an assistant coach, so there should be less of a learning curve. And then on top of that, it has been talked about over and over and so frequently over these last couple of weeks that the Sharks have been going through these tough but very fulfilling practices, that they have been pushed very, very hard in each and every one of these practices by Ryan Warsofsky. It seems as though that team chemistry is right at the bottom of the list in terms of priorities to actually work on, because when it comes to playing these games, there is just no connection between these players. Watching tonight, the Sharks couldn't string together more than like 2, maybe 3 passes before they'd end up just giving the puck away to the Ducks. Players trying to work it up to the point, but the defenseman had moved to the middle of the ice, or players rimming the puck along the boards, nobody's there to receive it. Players looking for these behind the back passes in front of the net, no Sharks player standing there to actually take a shot on net. It felt as though generally no communication, no chemistry, no connections, and so it's kind of rough to watch because these Sharks over these preseason games have been so average at best, and a lot of the times, especially in here tonight, below average. And you might be thinking, well, it's preseason, does it really matter all that much? No, not really, but considering the regular season is pretty close, it's hard to imagine that the Sharks will be able to just flip a switch instantly and suddenly look like a completely different team. And you take a look at the squads around the league who even in preseason are managing to have these explosive offensive performances, putting up 5 goals, 6 goals, 7 goals, building some excitement, building some hype for those teams as they go into their respective regular seasons. The Sharks have done nothing of the sort. Even in their one preseason win, it really was just like this come from behind, not all that dominant victory. And so for the Sharks, yeah, maybe they could turn things around, but it's hard to imagine that they'll be able to do so. And right now, you're kind of running out of time to actually find yourself some actual cohesion amongst your players. But anyhow, moving on to the roster that the Sharks brought out for tonight's game, it is again very similar to what we should expect to see to start the regular season. In particular, on the defensive side of things, these are likely the Sharks' starting 6 defensemen. At forward, obviously there are a couple of notable names missing. Both Granlund and Celebrini, I believe, are dealing with some sort of lingering issue. We know Celebrini is what his is. Granlund is a bit more mysterious, but both of them should be healthy for the start of the regular season. But because both missed this game, we got to see Wennberg on the top line with Eklund and Toffoli. And I will start off with Wennberg, who has been one of the more frustrating players of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks, because he's been so incredibly inconsistent. There have been shifts. In fact, there have been entire periods in which Wennberg has looked rather good. At times, he's able to come over the boards, use his stick handling and his puck possession skills and his playmaking to actually look really good on the ice. But then there are so many other shifts in which he comes over and you barely even notice him there. He's making these defensive errors. He's trying too hard in the defensive zone. He's giving pucks away, and he's forcing plays that just aren't actually there. And so it's definitely been frustrating to watch, especially since he's supposed to be this veteran guy who's bringing a certain level of consistency. The Sharks have played a pretty penny to actually bring him over to San Jose, $5 million per year in free agency. And of course, it's preseason, so it's hard to really gauge whether he's actually giving it his all. But at the moment, not a lot to get excited about from Wennberg in a consistent basis. When it comes to his 2 line mates, we have William Eklund, who has been okay throughout this preseason. His first couple of games weren't great. His third one was a bit better for sure, more like in average. Here tonight, I thought again it was solid, still well below the level of what you would expect from William Eklund, but again, he's kind of a bit of a victim of the fact that the Sharks as a whole, as a unit, just haven't really been getting much of a connection together. Eklund is looking for these passes. Nobody's really home to actually be able to receive them. So he was definitely one of the Sharks' better forwards tonight, but it's not really saying much considering the Sharks were heavily outplayed by the Ducks. On the other side of things, we have Tyler Toffoli, who I've talked about again and again as having very little variation in his level of play throughout this preseason. And once again, unsurprisingly, that hasn't really changed. Maybe Toffoli was like slightly worse in previous games. You could argue he was like a 6 on 10. Maybe tonight he was a 5 on 10. Got a couple less looks offensively, but realistically, it's honestly somewhat the same. And so hard to give much of a criticism, but it should be hoped for that Toffoli is going to be able to raise that level of play once we get to the regular season start. Then we get to the second line, where we have Smith and Zetterlund, who of course have been stapled together throughout much of this preseason, if not the entirety of it, and they're joined by Danil Gushchin. And it's been an incredibly hectic last couple of days for Gushchin, because back on Wednesday it was reported that at the Sharks practice, Gushchin was actually skating with Giovanni Smith and Ethan Cardwell on the Sharks' fifth line. And you may be thinking, well, there's no fifth line in hockey games, and that is indeed the case. What the fifth line is reserved for is the players who aren't actually expected to be in the lineup, which was incredibly upsetting on paper. Gushchin had been the Sharks' best preseason player through the first half of the preseason. He had been so good, and so to see him penciled in, seemingly to not actually start the season, was incredibly disappointing. But on Thursday, he then got a run-up with the Sharks' second line, and that led into tonight's game, where indeed he found himself with Smith and Zetterlund. Now, the bad news is he was not as good as his first two games. The good news is the fact that it would have been difficult to actually match those levels of performances, because they were like 9 on 10 plays. Here tonight, I still thought Gushchin was actually pretty decent and still a positive impact player for the San Jose Sharks, but it was definitely a few percentage points worse than where he had been previously at, which is not a very good thing, because while I still think he is worthy for a lineup spot, the fact that Warsofsky, after those first two dominant games, was even considering him not being in the lineup, he needed another really good performance, which didn't quite happen here tonight. I thought he used his body relatively well, even for his size. I thought he used his speed exceptionally well. There were a couple of strong desperation plays to either keep pucks alive in the offensive zone or clear them out of the defensive zone. He got lost a couple of times defensively, but not too bad, and not so much that really stood out in an ugly way, and even got a couple of offensive chances as well. Sure, he wasn't having those big standout moments like he did in his first two games, but I still thought it was, like I said, a positive impact game for Gushchin. When it comes to his two line mates, we have Will Smith. His first game in the preseason was uneventful. His second one was an improvement, in particular that second period where he actually started to look really good. Here tonight, I thought it was again relatively tame, better than the first game, but still not that big hype that you were expecting to be built around Will Smith and his appearance here in this preseason for the San Jose Sharks. He had a couple of good passes, one to Gushchin at even strength, one to Eklund on the power play. His defensive game also wasn't too bad, though there was one really bad play in the late parts of the first period, those last few seconds, that led to a great chance for the Ducks. But generally, I thought he was okay in that area. It's just a situation where I imagine if Smith was not the 4th overall pick from the 2023 draft, he probably wouldn't even be much of a consideration to be able to make the Sharks out of training camp. But because he is, and the Sharks have a lot of hope in him, it seems like he's going to be getting this trial by fire to start the season. And hopefully, once the regular season does begin, and his line mates and everybody else like that is going to be definitely giving a higher level of effort, that he's going to be able to follow suit and actually manage to show that he belongs in the NHL, because currently you could definitely make an argument for him heading back to the Barracuda. When it comes to the final line mate here, we have Fabian Zetterlund, who's honestly been rather disappointing thus far through this preseason. Probably amongst the sort of locks to make the Sharks top 6, Eklund, Celebrini, Toffoli, Granlund, Zetterlund has probably been the least effective thus far. One could argue it's because he has been playing so consistently with Will Smith, who hasn't been all that great. But at the same time, Zetterlund being that top 6 guy for the Sharks last season, you'd think he'd be able to drive his line. He's been doing nothing of the sort. I talked about in his previous game that he was missing a lot of shots. He again continued that here tonight, though he even had less shot attempts. In fact, his shootout attempt that would have been able to extend the shootout had he managed to score was a missed shot, which was just kind of funny to see. But generally, there hasn't been a lot to like from Fabian Zetterlund. Hopefully he can pick it up as it goes on, but for a player who had really exploded and really impressed people last season to actually be that top line, that middle 6 type of guy for the San Jose Sharks, it's not going so well thus far. When it comes to then the third line, we have Coston, Dellandrea, and Grundstrom. I'll start with Klim Coston, who had an incredibly up and down game. There were a few shifts where Coston was incredibly dominant. He managed to actually score one of the Sharks' 2 goals here tonight, and so there is definitely a lot to like about his performance. But then at the same time, he also had 3 horrific giveaways in this game, like literally 3 moments that you could point to and say, wow, Coston, what was he even thinking in those moments? And it felt as though he really wasn't. Like I mentioned with Gushin, Coston also has a tendency to get lost in the defensive zone relatively frequently, and so it really comes with this incredibly inconsistent level of play. At his best, he definitely belongs in the NHL, but at his worst, it's difficult to find him a spot, so it really depends on where Warsofsky actually lands with that. If the decision comes down to Coston and Gushin, I personally would choose Gushin, but it's very possible, perhaps due to age and size, that Warsofsky will lean Coston. When it comes to the other winger on this line, we have Carl Grundstrom. I actually kind of liked Grundstrom's game. Obviously, it should be noted that from having watched him, there isn't a ton that's very exciting here. There's nothing that you see where you go, wow, Grundstrom's going to be this strong offensive player. He's going to put up like 30, 40 points next season. None of that is actually the case, but he's a tenacious forechecker. He works really hard. He's got some solid speed. He can be a bit of a nuisance for the opposing teams. And so as like a fourth liner for the Sharks this season, I think Grundstrom can actually fit into that role. So perhaps he could be solid in that area. And then when it comes to the final player on this line, Ty Dellandrea, unlike with Grundstrom, while there still wasn't that any high ceiling of strong offensive play, he didn't either have those tenacious plays of solid forechecking that I kind of like to see from Grundstrom. Perhaps you could argue because Grundstrom's the winger, so he's sort of going deeper into the offensive zone to actually make that, while Dellandrea is kind of hanging back. But still, it's a game in which I really wasn't remotely impressed with Dellandrea, so while I certainly could foresee him making the lineup, I definitely wouldn't be too upset if he actually ended up getting a healthy scratch. Then we get to the fourth line. The fourth line has been a bit of an issue for the Sharks throughout this entire preseason. A lot of times it's just been rather bad. Here tonight is actually a nice little change of pace because the fourth line for the Sharks actually pretty decent. And we'll start off with Givani Smith. Smith was kind of an afterthought coming into this season. Felt as though he was behind at least half a dozen players for actually being able to make it to the starting lineup. And while I do think that is still the case, I would be rather surprised if Givani Smith actually makes it for Game 1 of the regular season. He might actually be a bit closer than what we originally thought. He made a few really nice plays here tonight, actually showed off some decent speed. The problem that I have with Givani Smith is that I think talent-wise, he might just not be good enough to actually be a top 12 player in the NHL, even for a team that is expected to not be all that strong like the San Jose Sharks. And so it's hard to justify actually putting him into a top 12 here, but it was a good enough performance to, keep an eye on him as we move into the start of the regular season. When it comes to Nico Sturm, I thought it was actually a rather solid game for Sturm. He definitely is doing enough to be able to make it. I mean, it was never really in doubt, but in comparison to a player like Ty Dellandrea, I did like Sturm's game here tonight. Some really solid defensive plays and actually set up a couple of nice offensive ones as well. When it comes to Ethan Cardwell, kind of like with Coston, it was a very up and down game. There were a few times where you were like, wow, Ethan Cardwell looks really, really impressive. And then of course a couple of shifts where it was let's just say not so great. Obviously the Ducks' second goal, scored by Gauthier, was essentially a one-on-one between Cardwell and Gauthier, and not only was he unable to keep Gauthier from taking the first shot, but then he was unable to keep him from getting his own rebound for that actual goal. And so not necessarily a play that reflects super well onto what Cardwell was doing. His power play performances I also thought left a little bit to be desired on that second unit, but at even strength he was certainly good enough that it is a kind of a testament to the San Jose Sharks actually leaving him and keeping him around in training camp for as long as they have. He's not going to be making it to the team this season, at least not to start the year, but the fact that he's been hanging around shows that he's been quite solid, and indeed that continues here tonight, I'd say, overall. On the defensive side of things, like I mentioned, this is the six-man unit that the Sharks will be heading into next season with. Vlasic and Mukhamadullin didn't play for pretty much the entirety of this preseason, haven't really participated in training camp either due to injuries. They might be a factor at some point next year, but likely not for Game 1. It'll be interesting to see if these are the duos that the Sharks actually head into the season with: Walman, Ceci, Ferraro, Ruda, and then Thrun, Benning. When it comes to defensemen during the preseason, it is a little bit difficult to evaluate. I've talked about in the past how these established players, they don't necessarily take the preseason super seriously, but the thing is that when a forward does that, it's not the end of the world for the team. But when a defenseman is kind of just not really giving it their all, that's when a team can actually run into issues, and it could be a really, really big problem. And so when it comes to a lot of these guys, Ferraro, Benning, Ceci, this was a game in which it was still kind of a struggle. There wasn't a lot super positive about what we have been seeing. They kind of were hesitant at times tonight with failing to get these clears out or just icing the puck, which is something you don't really want to see. You want to be able to see the Sharks actually get away from that, because it was a massive crutch that the Sharks used a lot last season because they kind of were forced to. And so hopefully we can say that this is something that the Sharks are having to do in the preseason and it won't carry into the regular season, but I do have a sinking feeling that that's not necessarily the case. The defenseman who did impress me here tonight, I'll start off with Jan Ruda, who I thought has continuously been one of the Sharks' better defensemen throughout the entirety of this preseason, which is quite surprising because throughout the entirety of last year, I thought Ruda was actually very disappointing, that he was supposed to be this big veteran presence for the San Jose Sharks. Sure, Ruda is not much more than, let's say, like a sixth defenseman on any of these teams, but you would think he would have actually been a little bit more consistent. He was not, but thus far in this preseason, he's definitely giving it his all. So it seems as though he's got a lot more motivation, perhaps because he's on the final year of his contract. He knows he could get moved at the trade deadline. It seems he has a lot more motivation to actually make things happen. When it comes to Henry Thrun, we did see him score a goal here tonight. That was the one that tied the game in the last few minutes. It wasn't necessarily the most skillful goal, one that he'll have difficulties replicating considering it was a bit lucky, but we did also get to see a bit of an offensive showcase from Henry Thrun throughout the overtime, which could perhaps be a nice little sign of things to come offensively for Thrun, maybe not in the immediate future of this season, but at some point in his career, because with that extra open space, Thrun was actually doing some really nice things with it. So definitely a bit of a positive there, and a generally okay game for Thrun as well. When it comes to Jake Walman, he had been perhaps the best defenseman for the San Jose Sharks previously in the preseason. Here tonight, it was definitely a couple of steps below. I thought actually offensively he was a little bit better than what he has been, but defensively he was definitely a good bit worse. And then when it comes to the goaltender, we have Vitek Vanacek. He certainly did a lot for the Sharks here tonight. I wouldn't say he was faced with a ton of grade A chances. He was faced with a bunch of shots. I think he had like 40 shots against, but in terms of actual like really, really close calls, there weren't a ton, so he didn't have to stand on his head. But it should still be said that if the Sharks, let's say, got average goaltending, they probably would have ended up losing this game in regulation, like 4-2, something like that. So he certainly still did his best to try and keep the Sharks alive in this game. It just was not enough because, again, the Sharks just didn't have much push. They didn't have much offensive pressure. They didn't actually have many good looks. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow for the 6th and final preseason game, thankfully. That will be against the Vegas Golden Knights. And then a few days after that, on October 10th, will be the beginning of the regular season, Game 1 against the St. Louis Blues. Class dismissed.